So in the last episode... Yeah, whoops. Sorry. Everything was going so well, and then I just suddenly felt tired. There were several things that happened that kind of killed my motivation to do anything. But I really care about this project. And I thought it'd be damaging to the project if I worked on it while I'm not enthusiastic for it. So I just waited, and my enthusiasm just came back one day, just out of nowhere. But think about it this way. If somebody's really thirsty, the longer you go without giving them a glass of water, the more they're going to want it and appreciate it. And so imagine you wait 5 months without giving them a glass of water. They're really going to appreciate that. And thank you again for all being so amazing. We went from 3,000 to 20,000 subscribers last episode. So imagine if that's you, then this is 10,000, and then 20,000 is two. So in the last episode, we added ground pounding, diving, rolling on surfaces, a bunch of animations, rolling out of dives, diving off of walls. And in this episode, we're going to be making things good rather than bad, which they currently are. And what I mean by that is, while things may look like they're working on the surface, under the surface, they're kind of rushed and messy and unmanageable. Exhibit A. This is the animation node tree thing for the player. It's meant to contain all the logic for the animation. There's nothing logical about doing it like this. I don't know what it is at the moment, some kind of abstract artwork. It's hurting my brain to look at it, so let's fix it. There we go, simple enough. And we only broke all of the animation many times in every conceivable way, but totally worth it. Look how pretty it is. The next problem to fix was some camera clipping issues. So the first thing I forgot to do when I was writing the shaders is turn off the back faces, because when the camera clips through, you can see the inside of the object. Whereas if back faces are off and it clips through sometimes, you might not actually notice. The next problem is this. The way the camera currently works is that it chooses a point between the player and the place that the raycast collides with the wall. And this is to keep it away from the wall to avoid clipping issues. And I can adjust the camera's position along this vector. But the way I've got the camera smoothing into its position along this vector means it sometimes lags behind the point on the raycast, which is colliding with the wall, which means it can drag behind and actually clip into the wall as it's catching up. So what I did to remedy this without changing the smoothing too much, I don't want it to be snapping unnecessarily, is I kept the point on the wall that the raycast actually hits slightly away from the wall. So essentially, even if it drags behind, it still has a little bit of space to maneuver without actually clipping into the wall. But I also didn't want that to happen when it's colliding with the floor, because otherwise the camera gets too close to the player when you're like directly underneath. The last thing I did was to make a stupidly simple change, which was to change the near clipping plane value on the camera. It was actually somebody in the comments that reminded me that I had to do that. So thank you, whoever that was. I can't remember. I think there were several people actually. So now I thought we'd do something a bit different. A lot of you in the comments seem to like my animation. So I thought I'd take you through what I do in my animation step by step. And this is a new character. It's an enemy that has sort of a box armor mode, which it comes out of in order to run around. So this is the animation of it popping out into its standing up state. And then I'm going to move on to dealing with just the vertical movement of each of the parts. So what I mean by that is that they're going to lag behind, they're going to reach their peak height at different times to the hips in order to make it seem like all these different components have weight. So let's speed this up a bit. This is 4,000% speed. And you can see with the curves here, I'm just making sure everything's nice and flowing, and I've got these little sort of bumps and settles going on, and it's all about the curves when you're doing 3D animation. Your curves either want to look, they want to look sharp or completely smooth and nice, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The more minimalistic you go, a lot of the time, the better. Like, you don't want keyframes everywhere. And here we are. This isn't finished yet, but this is all just like vertical movement, tiny bit of rotation, and then we move on to animating the leg a bit. And here I'm just controlling everything via these IK, these like faux IK points that I've made. And you can make them just by parenting things in the editor in the correct way. There's no actual, IK logic going on here. I've just got a transform at the end of the foot, a transform at the beginning of the leg, so I can sort of achieve all of the animation that you get out of a professional rig. So then I just had to copy the keyframes over to the other legs, and if you make sure that your legs are scaled correctly, say right leg is 1 in the X scale, and the left leg is -1, then you can just copy the keyframe straight over, and it'll be mirrored animation automatically. It's quite a handy thing. So here's the result with all the keyframes copied over to all the legs. And then all that was left to do was to add a tiny bit of subtle rotation to the body. And then I played around with the color a bit, and now that's sort of all done. All these shapes that I'm using are just like placeholders, really. I'm going to update them with better models, and I've just kept the shapes and the volumes very simple in order to make it so that when I give it to an artist, they'll be able to do a lot with it and interpret it in their own way. But anyway, now I'm just going to rush through all the other animations I did instead of going into too much detail. So this one is an animation for when the enemy locks onto you and it kind of gets into its prepared state, ready to chase you. And then I gave it a bit of a funny run cycle, so it looks a bit like some sort of excited animal when it's chasing you around. And then I set up the nav mesh, which is what the enemy AI is going to use to sort of navigate around the level. And this is all auto-generated. Unity handles all of this. And it's actually amazing how easy and how accurate it was first time just doing this. And then after just adding a simple script just to tell the enemy to follow the player, look at this. He's following him around the level, avoiding the walls, and yeah, it's great. So simple. I mean, obviously not everything's working straight away. He just pushes you along instead of, there's no detection for getting hit or any animation for getting hit. And I can just stand on him and he doesn't do anything about it, so need to fix that. But first I got the proximity working so that he wakes up and then looks at you, startled, and then starts chasing you. And all of this logic is handled in a new script I made, which has a bunch of functions and enemy behaviors which you can hook up in the editor. None of the logic is controlled in the code, really. It's all done in events in the editor, which I really recommend because then you can use one script and create a bunch of different enemies instead of having to, hard code in all their different behaviors into separate scripts. So then I added some patrol points because I want it so that when he loses interest in you, or when you get too far away, he goes back to his little patrol area. And I've made it so that it's sort of visual in the editor. You can see the patrol route and the different sort of waypoints. And I've made it so that the enemy can wait for different amounts of time at different waypoints, checkpoints. And then I realized when I was putting the enemy's animations together that I can simplify the animator setup even more than I did for the player. So look how simple this is. It's crazy. And now the enemy follows for a set amount, well, a minimum amount of time, and then you also have to get a certain distance away before it gives up and heads back to its patrol point. And now it's got all the animations set up so that it walks around the patrol points and all the animations play and it waits at the different points for the required amount of time. And then if you get too close again, chases you again. Perfect. And the next thing to add is making sure that the player gets knocked back when he gets hit by the enemy. So the first thing I did was to add a little jump every time he collides with the player. And then I edited the angle of the jump so he's sort of getting knocked back every time. And then I made it so you sort of bounce a few times every time you get hit instead of just, coming to a complete stop. And it also disables your inputs before you've bounced a certain number of times because you've just been damaged, so you shouldn't be able to move immediately. And then I added a little bonk animation, which it's kind of hard to visualize in this state what it's going to look like when he's flying through the air. But after a bit of, trial and error, you just have to test things out. And I've got him doing a little bit of a scared wobble as he's sitting here. And then that's only the flying through the air animation, so I had to do a little, bum bounce animation, which is going to play repeatedly every time he bounces on his bum, so it'll play like 3 times in a row. And here it is added in. It still needs a bit of tweaking at this point, but it's starting to look pretty good. But the one thing was the chasing was a bit incessant, and obnoxious. So I had to make it so that he stops when he hits you and then carries on after like shaking it off a little bit. And then I added a little flash script to make you flash when you get damaged to show that you've been damaged. Then I made it so that jumping on the head of the enemy script doesn't damage you, it makes you jump again. So you can sort of bounce indefinitely on the enemy's head. And we need to be able to defeat the enemy, obviously. So I created these crushed variant parts and then made it so that you can crush the enemy by ground pounding, but at the moment it only switches over the models. It doesn't actually do anything to him, so he just keeps chasing you while he's crushed. But after a quick change, now you can ground pound the enemy and he explodes with a temporary explosion, which I want to create something similar, but I didn't create this one. I just have to be clear about that. And then just because it's fun, I just added a bunch of the enemies chasing you around. And yeah, they look pretty funny, all springing into action one after the other. There was a bit of a problem with the ground pounding the enemies and the camera, in that if you ground pound them, the camera stays locked onto you and you don't really get to see the enemy exploding all that well sometimes. So I fixed it so that when the sight of the camera is sort of perpendicular to the ground, it's a bit more lenient in the Y movement, it sort of eases up and down. But when you're looking straight down, it locks onto the player, so there's no leniency in the movement. And I increased that effect even more with a square function, so that yeah, it really just sticks to the ground and you can see the action. Then I made a little animation for the enemy when he attacks you. It does this little like shaking himself off animation. And then I not only wanted to add items being dropped by the enemies when you defeat them, but also debris, so that the bits of the robot go flying everywhere when you ground pound it. So I first added just, simple physics objects being spawned when you ground pound. Then I made it so that they bounce and then come to a standstill after a couple of bounces. Then I added the typical items being sucked into your body conveniently like they have in most games. And then with this script I made, you can just easily add new items to different enemies, even the player, or items. I could have a crate spawning them. And as an example here, I got the enemy spawning the different parts of its robot body. Then I made the loot shrink subtly when it gets sucked into your body. And I made it so that the debris sort of fades away after a time, which I had to make a new shader for. And then if you turn off collisions between the bits of debris, then they spread a bit more evenly. I made it so that different bits of debris can have different velocities, so that I can, for example, tell the legs not to fly as far as the body. Then, as I mentioned in the last episode, I wanted to start thinking about effects. So here I've created this shader that adds like a gradient mask to a plane. And with this I was hoping to achieve some kind of like whooshing speed lines for the ground pound. So the idea was that it would like scroll across a texture quickly to create the effect of like a whoosh, something cutting through the air. And this is the result of that. It looks a tiny bit strange. I kind of like it. It's working a little bit. But it turned out to be quite problematic when it spawns in certain situations, so I decided to go with another approach. So I started to look at particle trails for an alternative to create speed lines, and I quite like this result. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I needed to clean up certain things about this project, and one of those things was that the player, it's all just one massive unwieldy script at the moment. All his movement, all his animation, it's all just controlled in one big long chunk of code. So I wanted to create something like I made for the enemy earlier in this episode, where I can just plug in everything in the editor and quickly create logic so that I can, for example, spawn particle effects when he jumps, tell them to turn off, when he's not jumping, when he moves to running, spawn another one. Currently, if I want to do any of that, I have to go and find the right place in this massive script and hard code it all in, and I can't create any sort of other controllable characters with that script because it's so specifically designed for this player movement. So here we go. This took ages, but wow, it's so worth it. I've separated everything into different functions, different conditions that need to be met that I can just plug and play in the editor. And now I can use this script to create almost any behavior or any control scheme, I can add new moves to the character without really adding much code at all. And just to be clear here, there's no more logic in the script. So there's nothing to tell the player to jump in the script. There's nothing to tell the player how to slide down the wall. It's all logic that's hooked up in the editor, which means I can then, copy paste this script and create a completely new controllable character, all using one script. And it also means that I could hand it off to another artist who doesn't really know much about code at all, and they could go and create their own controllable character with it. So for example here, this is the wall launch move. I tell it to detect the wall in front, detect whether the player's in a position to go into a roll along the wall, give it all the parameters, tell it which state to go into next, which will be the wall launching state. And there we go. Now I can easily plug in new particle effects, and here I've got a ground pound set up, which creates some shockwaves. So all I had to do that is create the particle effects themselves and then tell them to play when it goes into the ground pounding state. And we've also got like lines coming out from the center of the circles, speed lines for when you ground pound, for when you run, when you jump off the ground. There's 3 little trails, and I found that they're quite versatile, these particle trail effects. That's it for now. Next time we're going to continue experimenting a bit with particle effects. We're also going to move a bit closer to the goal of creating a playable demo. You'll be pleased to know that I have recorded some more footage at this point, so I should have stuff ready for the next episode, so it won't be, 5 months before the next episode.